And next, we're turning to communications challenges in the area of equity, inclusion, and fairness. And Audi Matias, Interim Chief Diversity Officer for Institutional, where's your title, Audi? It's disappearing here. For Equity and Inclusion at SUNY Empire State College. And you can redo your intro if I've got it totally wrong, Audi. So you are moderating this session and very happy you're going to be kicking this off.
Thank you, Holly, and good afternoon, everyone. It's fine. It's a long title. Don't worry about it. In academia, we love long titles, so that's okay. Again, good afternoon, everyone. And yes, we will continue the discussion started by the previous panel, which was a great segue to our topic, right? We're going to continue talking about the issues and the choices about areas in which terminology isn't being used consistently, perhaps, and or new terms are continued to come up. And this one is equity, inclusion, and fairness. And it is with great pleasure that I introduce our panelists, and then they will have 2 minutes, just like the previous panel, to answer a couple of questions regarding these terminologies. So first, in alphabetical order, we have Christine Barrow, Director at Education Strategy Group, Wendi Copeland, Chief Strategic Partnership Activation Officer at Goodwill Industries International, Dhanfu, Elston, Chief of Staff and Senior Vice President for Strategy and Complete at Complete College America, and Tina Gridiron, Vice President, ACT's Center for Equity and in Learning. So I think I got everyone. Now, with that said, the questions around are very similar to what we were doing before, right? Equity, inclusion, and fairness. These are terms that we don't all have consistent definitions. You know, you might have an institutional definition, and then you have the national, the local. There's a wide range of variations. So I would like for the panelists to talk about what do we mean by these terms, right? Equity, inclusion, fairness, and how they can they guide our work in Credential? They're very important. You know, this has been a conversation in all the medias. And also, when we want equitable credentials, we're thinking about how we can create a system that is fair to everyone. So what does that mean in terms of what we should do or should avoid, right? Because that's the flip side, right? It's not just about what we are doing, but what we should avoid. Why wouldn't start with Wendi?
All right, thank you, Audie. I appreciate this. We are really excited that Goodwill Industries is at the table having this conversation because people are like, well, why is Goodwill here? What about, they do something about stores and stuff people used to love, right? Well, that's part of our how we pay for it. Our why is that we want everyone to have the opportunity to thrive through learning and the power of work. And in doing that, we've got to talk about equity because everyone means everyone. And that means that we're not screening people out. So when we talk about inclusion and equity, we think that we're really leaning into belonging. How do we make sure that everyone has a space? And in a world where there are 11 million job openings and 3.2 million people who left during the pandemic who have not come to the labor market, they don't see a place for themselves in this world. So whether it is a credential of whatever ilk, or whatever design, we need to make sure that we are inclusive, that we are ruling people in rather than screening people out, that we are finding a way to that the puzzle fits together rather than the puzzle pieces are excluded. And so when we're talking about inclusion and equity, we think this is leaning into belonging.
Thank you, Wendi. I think I like that. Everyone is everyone, right? We have to remember that. Particularly when we're talking about the way credentials have been growing exponentially, right, nationwide. What about you, Tina?
So I'll just jump in here and say thumbs up to Wendi as part of ACT Center for Equity and Learning. We are exploring how equity shows up in all of our work keys assessments, our national career readiness certificates, and in our work ready communities. But one of the things that I often like to think about when I think of the difference between equity, inclusion, and fairness is that equity is what we measure. How do we know that all populations, all individuals are achieving not just the participation opportunity, but the outcomes that we are saying are available. So for me, equity is what we measure. Inclusion is the environment that is impactful, that is effective, that is warm, that is empowering, that is welcoming. Inclusion is the space that we create for the work to happen. Equity is what we measure so that we know we are making a difference. And for me, fairness is the work that we do to ensure that all of the intended and unintended biases are addressed in the design. For me, there are many ways that each individual on this call, in the work that we do, can play a role in the equity, fairness, and inclusion equation. All three are important. All three have value. All three are necessary for us to realize the vision of our democratic experiment, if you will. And there is lots of opportunities to unpack. How do we know that we're making a difference? Equity is what we measure. Inclusion is the space that makes sure that everyone is involved in the process and feels empowered and inspired and welcomed in the process. And fairness is the work that we do to ensure that all intended and unintended biases are addressed in the design. So that's where I show up. I'm sure that others would have plenty other perspectives to add to that equation. Know this, whatever we use is a first step. And there is always room for additional perspectives and ideas to enhance our understanding of equity, inclusion, and fairness. I try to show up with from a place of humility to say, I'm willing to jump in, and please help me so that we swim together well, so that the train that Holly mentioned gets from point A to point B, and we are all successful on that train. Thanks, Audi.
Thank you, Tina. And it is interesting that you mentioned that you're open, right, to the differences and to learn more, because these are, unlike the first terms that we discussed earlier in the discussion, it's equity, fairness, inclusion, diversity. These are terms that are constantly changing if you think about it, right? We're adding, as we know more about, right, the issues that are being experienced by the marginalized populations, we continue to expand and edit, if you want to think about that term, this definition. So it's very important to keep that in mind in the work that we do, but also us as human and individuals. So with that in mind, Dhanfu, would you like to comment on your definitions?
Sure, I'd be happy to jump in. Audi, I think you said something that's really important. It's the evolution of the terminology, and I think that just being extremely candid, we spend so much time on the vernacular and the language without focusing on what the expectations and outputs are associated with that language. And so, I think that's, it's good that we are having these national conversations around diversity, equity, inclusion, belongingness, all of those key and critical terms. But I think it's important to really focus on what it is that we're trying to solve. And so when I think about this work around equity, we know that we're talking about disparities and how they affect educational opportunities, workforce opportunities, social mobility, specifically for some of the most minoritized student populations and social identities. So, I think depending on the organization you're talking to, they may focus on a wide variety. We may be talking about, gender, we may be talking about citizenship status, we may be talking about, physical ability. I would say that race tends to be a common thread across all of those different identities. But, it's less about defining equity and more talking about what an equitable approach looks like. And to me, an equitable approach is developing strategic solutions to take systemic action to address those inequities. It's not just naming the thing, but really moving into an action-oriented approach to what do we do about it and what are some of the historic and systemic problems that are there, which leads us into that question around like inclusion. I think that when you talk to most individuals, inclusion is a value, it's a unique quality and perspective about including meaningful opportunities and diverse perspectives. But I also think that the missing piece of this inclusion conversation is the power dynamic. And it's really not about just ensuring that the right people are at the table. It's ensuring that they have a voice. And having voice means that people have to be involved in the planning, the decision-making, and their own personal efficacy about what it means for their lives and their communities. So who's at the table, who's controlling that dialogue, is part of what this larger equity and inclusion conversation has to be about.
Thank you. And I can see a couple of different things that are coming up that will be important for the second piece, right? What do we do about here where we're talking about credentials, right? Based on this discussion. But before we move there, Christine, you still somewhere? I know I saw you earlier. Oh, there you are. Somehow my screen kind of moved around. Christine, what about you? What are your thoughts?
So I would like to plus one pretty much what everyone else has said. I think that a big piece of this is clarifying the end state. If we can clarify what this looks like at the end, then I think that it makes it easier to build systems, which we'll talk about in a moment. To me, what this means is no matter the learner, the credential opens the door to economic mobility. And so that's where I think we start to get to what does an inclusive environment, both from a workforce perspective, but also from an education space look like? That no matter what credential we're talking about, it's going to lead to some economic mobility, which is why the students are coming to these learning spaces to begin with. Equity obviously is going to be an important piece when we're doing this. It's got to be kind of a guiding principle of sorts to kind of lead where we want to go. Tina's comment on the measures, I think, is spot on. We have to be reviewing the credentials that are being offered, who's enrolled in them, and most importantly, probably who's completing them. And unless we've got structures and systems in place that are leading to not just getting people in the door, but the same equitable outcomes on who's going out the door with those credentials, then the system needs some adjustment. And so that's where I think we've got to really dig in on looking at the data associated with these credentials. That's where I think you get to the equity part of the definition. We have to identify the gaps. What's causing those gaps? I will postulate that a big piece of it is the students not having access to resources that they need. And so I think a lot of this will touch on some of the systems, but at the end of the day, we have to listen to the stakeholders. That means listening to the students, the employers, and the educators at the table. And I think the conversation we're having today around this really sets the stage for that. And we can talk more about some of the systems and structures, I think, when we talk about the next question.
Thank you, Christine. And yes, you started talking about what we need to be doing, right? Listening to the employers, identify those gaps, definitely. So the question for everyone, right? So I noticed that sense of belonging was mentioned, right? That's very important. Whatever the learner is coming from, right? We need to make sure that they feel that these credentials means something to them and they belong to this community, right? Because this is not an individual ticket, but it's really a community, right? That we are providing them when we're talking about credentials, particular credentials as you go. We talk about also, it was mentioned, barriers, right? Understanding what are the barriers that are influencing and the biases that are around credentialing and everything that goes around that topic. And the other one was having a voice, making sure that the students do have a voice when we think about our work. So back to you, back to the panelists. My apologies, my voice is going out. What does that mean in terms, like, we are talking about all these issues, right? And the definitions, but as we move forward with this project, what does that mean in terms of what we should be doing? And Christine started touching into that area. Let's see, this time let's start with Tina.
Oh, wow. For a moment there, I thought we were going to go back to Christine so that she could continue. What should we start doing as leaders that are committed to the outcomes? Take risks to lean in on equity, on issues of inclusion and fairness, to start the conversation there as we engage in design, to make sure that those who have been minoritized or those who have been disconnected are at the table. What should we do? Start with an asset framework that every individual is aspiring to the success with the credential. And if they are not yet achieving it, what are we doing to re-engineer the design so that they are able to access it? I want to leave folks with a great body of work. There's a gentleman by the name of Trabian Shorters who is engaged in asset framing design, asset framing focus. When we think about our work, I would highly recommend the Be Me community as a wealth of resource information for those of us that want to start from that asset perspective. And the work that Jobs for the Future is doing on issues of outcomes around wealth. We talk about economic mobility. Where can we start? Great work that Michael Collins is doing with Jobs for the Future is a great place to start. If we aren't seeing economic mobility through the credentials that we are promoting, then we have to ask the question, what new work needs to be done to ensure that that economic mobility is there? I will turn it to my colleague. I see Wendi nodding her head. I'm going to say, Wendi, take it away.
Because I'm cheering about the asset-based approach, because all talent brings knowledge and skills to the table, and believing that people can often means that they will. And I think one of the things I think we should get rid of is believing that we know what people can't do, because we don't. And how do we begin with believing that people can? How do we design to include people in, meet people where they are, connect them with credentials, and then connect the credentials? Because there shouldn't be distinct areas where only one group of people can be. That cannot be anymore. And if you read the demographic drought by MZ and 2 reports, last year's and this year's, is very clear. We need all the talent on the table, and we need to get people who have believed that there's no place for them. I'll call them overlooked talent from overlooked communities. It's time to get them in, because the issue isn't that they don't want to be at the table. It's that people don't believe that there's a place for them. And I also believe that it is critical that we address the 2 first barriers. One of my colleagues, Sonia Francis, said yesterday, the first barrier is lack of awareness. The second barrier is the believing that people like me don't have a place in work like this, and getting people to believe and be aware of the opportunities to connect with credentials, and making that part of the landscape that we build that includes all is critical to making this work.
Thank you, Tina, and thank you, Wendi. I got my voice back. So when that is back, I'm going to channel Wendi. Everyone is everyone, right? That's the key. So can we get Christine and then Dhanfu? We only have a few minutes, and I don't know if my voice is going to go back again. So I just want to make sure I do the order. Thank you.
Sure. So a couple things that I would say from a systems and structures perspective. We want to make sure that we're emphasizing credentials of value that lead to thriving wages. So family sustaining is one thing, thriving, high wages is much more important. I will say somewhat disconnected comments in terms of my resources and thoughts on this, but Tina and Wendy's comment about belonging, I think systems and structures, creating systems and structures that are focused on that sense of belonging, especially for adult learners, and even more importantly for adult learners of color, that sense of belonging. I was on a call with someone else who had recently done a survey of adult learners in their community college system. And time and again, the students' comments, the open-ended comments were focused on, I'm scared to go into a class with a bunch of 18-year-olds. I'm scared to go into a class with a bunch of 18-year-olds. I don't know what to expect when I go into a class. And so creating systems and structures that are welcoming environments for these learners, I think is going to help us to get to some of the equity and inclusion, that sense of belonging for these learners. Identify who the learners are listening to as they're making the decisions. Also, another thing in our work that we've done, we were talking with some of the advisors who routinely say they get calls from adult learners saying, hey, I know I need a better job. I know I need a credential to get there. Any ideas on what I should do? That first voice needs to be someone who's informed and has the right tools and ideas for how to connect students to making those informed decisions, and encouraging credentials that are opening doors to future learning, so that these those pathways, like we saw in the Stanford description there, that there's a pathway to more. If you need to step off, no problem. You've got a way to come back on and keep it moving from there. Otherwise, we're not going to get the equity that we need in the pathways. I will turn it over to Dhanfu.
Christine, I think that, just to add on to your point and kind of put a bow on this larger conversation, I think we all agree what the output should be. Structurally, that, what the outcomes should be. The outputs are probably the biggest challenges in organizing these structural reforms that we're talking about. So no matter what kind of system we're discussing, whatever provides a credential of purpose and value, whether that be technical degrees, whether it be a workforce opportunity for increased upskilling, all the way through the different types of degree types. I think that one of the biggest challenges for us is that the structure is not well designed. And so you already talked about, Christine, advising and onboarding to purposeful careers, you know what I'm saying? Not happening at most institutions. Employer engagement, everyone says it needs to happen. If you talk to most institutions, they have no conversations between what's needed, what are the local, what's the local workforce look like, and how that aligns with competencies and programs of studies. And last but not least, ultimately, you've got to bake these ideas in with policy. So state and federal policy are going to be critical to making all these things happen. So I think that all those things have to happen. Back to that larger piece around equity, Black and brown students are the least represented in the fastest growing, highest paying jobs in the country. That's the problem we're trying to solve. And if we don't fix those structural pieces, we won't ever get to that larger outcome.
Thank you. And we went a little bit over our time by 3 minutes. Thank you very much. I think a lot of very important points have been brought up that hopefully will come up at the end again as we put together everything. And now I'll just hand this over back to Holly. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Audie and panel. Just fabulous conversation.